In these times when the conflict in Gaza is all but monopolizing the news, we repeatedly hear statesmen and diplomats, elite scholars, and their wide-eyed followers all preaching wearisome platitudes with the air of prophets, delivering a profound truth to an otherwise ignorant world. These time-worn verses on peaceful negotiation, honest dialogue, and diplomatic settlement are true and obvious, but also naive and fanciful. Far-fetched ideals and noble-sounding statements of high-minded theorists who blithely ignore elemental and undeniable realities which are clearer to common minds. When the perpetrator of the act which caused the present war is a designated terrorist organization, and when the fundamental tenet of its foundational charter is the annihilation of the state it attacked, and when it and its principal patron, the state of Iran, violently deny the right to exist of the nation it is in conflict with, the notion of negotiation and peaceful settlement becomes a pointless farce and a mockery of diplomacy. Nevertheless, these trite proclamations, devoid of common sense, have strangely powerful effects in places where dubious ideals paired with theatrics and extravagant language can pass for truth. It is inconceivable that these seasoned politicians, diplomats, and the educators who define the doctrines acceptable to the academic world of today should be this starkly ignorant of the history of this conflict and the straightforward facts related to the present war. To those with a rudimentary acquaintance of such facts and able to exercise a trace of impartiality in their evaluation, it is apparent that most of these pronouncements of the liberal vanguard and the complicit media fraternity are designed primarily for the advancement of domestic political interests and their pet liberal ideologies. Misleadingly attractive phrases, rearranged facts, half-truths, and outright lies are drawn from the political and diplomatic trick boxes to hoodwink and appease those in their electorates most in need of appeasement. Combined with regular falsified news from a leftist-infested media and the unavoidable celebrity voices, glamorous and clueless, this mass of discolored and misshapen information presents a formidable mix of propaganda and disinformation to legitimize a terrorist organization and to whitewash its image. Large segments of average people are seen to have been deceived into a spurious fervor and induced to participate in mindless shows of allegiance to a cause they are largely ignorant of. To those who skillfully manipulate such people, the propaganda advantages so gained for the advancement of their ideology and political aims are enormous. In any discourse on this war, certain facts remain clear and incontrovertible even to those with irredeemably prejudiced views on the State of Israel. Israel was subjected to a terrorist attack of an unprecedented degree on the 7th of October 2023. An act of mass murder, rape, and kidnapping largely on civilians in a region adjacent to Gaza. Hamas, being a terrorist organization, was not bound by any law of any international organization, nor obliged to respect any code or convention on the conduct of warfare, legal or moral. It has openly disregarded any precept or standard of humanity, legal or ethical, concerning the treatment of innocents in war. Innocents were actually the identified and defined primary target of this attack. They conducted their campaign while it was allowed to last, with unspeakable brutality, committing deliberate and calculated acts of unimaginable horror, mostly on women and children. They broadcast their successes that day with fanatical fervor and gloated over the suffering of their victims. It is perplexing and peculiar that, to those who unceasingly cite international law on the welfare of civilians trapped in conflict and regularly use the word genocide, these actions were reconcilable with their selectively modified versions of such laws. On the other hand, the country that was the victim of the terrorist attack has been on trial ever since October 7th. Its government has been coerced and shamed to submit to a confoundingly one-sided standard of legitimacy, tolerance, and humanity in the conduct of its war of reprisal. The adversary is permitted to brazenly parade civilian hostages and even taunt the people of Israel with vile images of their suffering, and to use them as military credits and objects of barter, with no equivalent expression of outrage from the superior-minded statesmen and media men who expound international law and insistently cite such laws when the objective is to discredit the government of Israel. The media is oddly silent and evasive on this, but will exploit every image, every report, often tampered with or falsified to present a lopsided view of suffering among the civilians of Gaza, who are undoubtedly suffering, but suffering from the refusal of its leadership to repudiate its campaign of terror. Which country on earth would passively abide an unprovoked attack on its civilian population and the committing of unspeakable atrocities on its territory? Many self-righteous politicians have deftly ignored the realities which are integral and indispensable to any discourse on Gaza. The attack on Israel was a self-confessedly intentional act of cruelty on civilians. The military targets were a few remote outposts. The vast majority of the victims were innocent civilians. The perpetrators took perverse pleasure in committing bestial acts too horrific to recount in any narrative. The retaliatory actions by the State of Israel, a sovereign right of defense inherent to any nation, and the consequences of those actions on civilians have had the inevitable results, however regrettable or unfortunate, of urban warfare in a densely populated theater of war. It has been inestimably worsened by the strategy chosen by its terrorist adversary to conduct its operations, embedded in densely populated civilian enclosures for military advantage, and for strategic advantage from the propaganda merits derived from carefully stage-managed footage of civilian suffering to distract an audience already deceived by a media resolutely predisposed to an anti-Israel view of the entire human tragedy. There is no doubt about the conditions of prodigious suffering which prevail in Gaza, as in any war zone, big or small. There are many conflicts in the world today where greater suffering and real, documented instances of atrocities committed by soldiers prevail. These conflicts are not heard of, nor do they occupy the minds and speeches of liberal theorists. An uncomfortable and ugly reality of history is that all nations or any polity whose leadership committed an act of unprovoked war, whether just or ill-conceived, made its own populace subject to suffering and destruction from retaliatory action, unless it was Genghis Khan and the likes of who could wield overwhelming might and totally extinguish any possible retaliation. Any country so attacked which had enough force and capacity to retaliate would subject the populace of the aggressor to suffering. That's been a simple, if unpleasant, reality any time in history. Israel is not engaging in something singular or unprecedented. Which country in recent history provided humanitarian assistance to the people of a country they were in conflict with? Ukraine, which is engaged in a just war of retaliation against an aggressor. The U.S., which was attacked unprovoked at Pearl Harbor. The UK blockaded the seas of Germany to starve the German people into submission in World War I, and now it is clamoring insistently with patently fake righteousness against civilian suffering. In the astoundingly flawed and twisted perceptions of those intoxicated with today's progressive ideology, the status of being a terrorist organization seemingly accords to it the right to perpetrate a heinous act of violence, and also retain the right of dictating to the victim exactly how much violence it can inflict in reprisal. This is preposterous to anyone except those hypocrites who pontificate in the halls of international justice and rampage in the streets with virulent chants in their mouths and terrorist insignia on their heads.